It began subtly, the way storms often do, a low rumble beneath a sunny sky, easy to dismiss until it's too late. My son, Ryan, had always been a quiet child. At 8 years old, he was thoughtful and kind, with a mischievous streak that could melt hearts. But in the weeks following his birthday, something began to shift. At first, I chalked it up to growing pains. Children have phases, don't they? But as the days turned to weeks, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this wasn't just a phase. It was something much darker. The first sign came one evening after dinner. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, his homework spread out before him. I was washing dishes, humming to myself, when I heard him whispering. "Ryan?" I said, turning to look at him. "Who are you talking to?" He froze, his pencil hovering over the page. "No one," he said without looking up. I laughed softly. "Well, stop it, kiddo. You're creeping me out." He smiled, a strange, lopsided grin that didn't reach his eyes, and went back to his work. The whispers grew more frequent over the next few days. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible. But one night, I woke to the sound of Ryan's voice drifting from his room. I crept to his door and peeked inside. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across his face. His lips moved rapidly, but the words were foreign, guttural. "Ryan?" I called softly. He turned to me, his eyes wide and startled. "I wasn't doing anything," he said quickly, scrambling to his feet. I frowned. "You were talking in your sleep?" "Yeah," he said, nodding a little too quickly. "Just a bad dream." But as I tucked him back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. The changes didn't stop at the whispers. Ryan, who had always been a picky eater, suddenly developed a voracious appetite. He devoured his meals with an intensity that bordered on unsettling, his gaze fixed on me as he chewed. Then came the drawings. One afternoon, I found his sketch pad open on the coffee table. Ryan had always loved to draw, his pages usually filled with superheroes and dinosaurs. But these drawings were different. They were dark, chaotic, figures with twisted limbs and empty eyes. In one, a figure stood surrounded by flames, its grin sharp and menacing. "Ryan," I said, holding up the sketch pad, "what's this supposed to be?" He shrugged. "Just a picture. It's a little scary, don't you think?" He looked at me, his expression blank. "I like scary things." The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Ryan had been invited to a birthday party down the street. It was a bright, sunny day, the kind that made the world feel safe and ordinary. I stayed to chat with the other parents, sipping coffee as the kids played in the backyard. At some point, one of the boys let out a piercing scream. We all rushed outside to find Ryan standing over the birthday boy, his hands clenched into fists. The boy was crying, his face red and streaked with tears. "What happened?" I demanded, pulling Ryan aside. "He started it," Ryan said, his voice calm, almost bored. The other boys' parents weren't convinced, and neither was I. But Ryan's expression was so cold, so unfeeling, that I didn't know how to respond. That night, I sat Ryan down at the kitchen table. "Something's going on with you," I said. "I want to help, but you have to tell me what's wrong." "Nothing's wrong," he said, his tone clipped. "Ryan, please," I begged. "You're not yourself. You've been acting different." He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Maybe this is who I've always been," he said softly. The word sent a chill down my spine. Desperate for answers, I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence. The whispers, the drawings, the outbursts, they all pointed to something beyond my understanding. I even considered taking Ryan to a therapist, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something a professional could fix. This was something else. One night, I woke to a loud crash. I rushed to Ryan's room, my heart pounding. The lamp by his bed had shattered, the pieces scattered across the floor. Ryan stood in the middle of the room, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. "What happened?" I asked, stepping carefully over the shards of glass. "I don't know," he said, his voice flat. "Did you knock it over?" "No." "Then what?" Before I could finish, he turned to me, his eyes blazing with an intensity one had never seen before. "Sometimes things break, he said, his tone calm and unnerving. The final straw came a few days later. I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a low growl. At first, I thought it was the neighbor's dog, but then I realized the sound was coming from Ryan's room. I crept down the hall, my pulse racing. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw Ryan sitting on his bed. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched. "Ryan?" I called softly. He turned slowly, his face shrouded in shadow. And then he smiled, a wide, toothy grin that didn't belong on an 8-year-old. "Mom," he said, his voice low and distorted. "Why are you afraid of me?" My breath caught in my throat. "I'm not afraid," I said, though my trembling hands betrayed me. Ryan tilted his head, his smile widening. "You should be." He turned back to the wall, his body rigid and still. I backed away, my heart pounding, and locked myself in my bedroom. The next morning, Ryan was back to normal, or at least as normal as he could be. "Good morning, Mom," he said cheerfully, pouring himself a bowl of cereal. I stared at him, searching for any trace of the unsettling figure from the night before. But he looked like my son, ordinary, innocent. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, a nightmare conjured by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was in my house, whatever was wearing my son's face, wasn't Ryan anymore. I couldn't look at Ryan the same way after that night. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, that I was overreacting to normal childhood behavior. But no amount of rationalizing could erase the memory of his smile, or the way his voice had distorted into something inhuman. Ryan knew something was wrong, though he never asked. He just watched me with those dark, knowing eyes, like he could see the fear twisting in my chest. The first real break came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, my thoughts spinning, when I heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't coming from Ryan's room. They were coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, the hardwood floor cold beneath my feet. The sound grew louder as I approached, a low murmur that sent chills racing down my spine. Ryan was standing in front of the TV, his back to me. The screen was off, but the faint glow of moonlight reflected his small silhouette. "Ryan?" I called softly. He turned slowly, his face bathed in shadow. "I wasn't talking to you," he said. The days that followed were worse. Ryan started asking strange questions, things no child his age should even think about. "Mom," he said one morning as I was making breakfast, "what do you think happens when we die?" I froze, the spatula hovering over the frying pan. "Why are you asking that?" He shrugged. "I just want to know. Do we go somewhere? Or do we stay here?" The way he said it, so calm and detached, made my stomach turn. "I don't know," I said finally. "No one does." Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the window. "I think some people stay here," he said, "even when they're not supposed to." I started noticing other things. Objects would go missing and reappear in places they didn't belong. Lights flickered, even though the bulbs were new. And then there were the scratches, long, jagged marks that appeared on the walls and furniture overnight. One evening, I came home from work to find Ryan sitting on the floor, his hands smeared with dirt. "What are you doing?" I asked, setting my bag down. "Planting something," he said without looking up. I glanced around, confused. There were no plants, no seeds, just the odd, swirling patterns he had traced into the dirt. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, gesturing at the mess. Ryan finally looked up, his eyes gleaming. "It was already here," he said. That night, I decided to do something I had been avoiding for weeks. I called Father Michael. He had been a family friend for years, the kind of priest who made faith seem warm and approachable. I hadn't been to church in ages, but I hoped he wouldn't hold that against me. "Something's wrong with Ryan," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know how to explain it, but he's different." Father Michael listened patiently as I described everything. The whispers, the drawings, the way Ryan seemed to know things he shouldn't. When I finished, there was a long pause. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said finally. "But in the meantime, pray. And don't leave him alone." The next day, Father Michael arrived just after lunch. He greeted Ryan warmly, but the moment their eyes met, the atmosphere shifted. Ryan's expression hardened, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "Why are you here?" he asked bluntly. Father Michael smiled gently. Just a visit. Your mom says you've been having a tough time lately. I'm fine, Ryan said, his voice cold. Father Michael turned to me. Could we talk in private? In the kitchen, I poured Father Michael a cup of tea, my hands trembling. What do you think? I asked. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. It's hard to say, but I'll be honest. This feels unnatural. What do you mean? There's a darkness around him, Father Michael said. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's strong. We'll need to approach this carefully. Father Michael suggested a house blessing as a first step. It might help cleanse whatever energy is affecting him, he said. And if not, we'll take stronger measures. That evening, as Ryan played in his room, Father Michael and I walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. At first, everything seemed fine, but as we approached Ryan's room, the air grew thick and heavy, like walking through molasses. Father Michael paused, his face pale. Do you feel that? He whispered. I nodded, my chest tight. When we opened the door, Ryan was sitting on the bed, his back to us. Ryan, I said softly. He didn't move. Father Michael stepped forward, holding out his crucifix. Ryan, we're here to help you, he said. Ryan turned slowly, his eyes blazing with an unnatural light. You can't help me, he said, his voice layered with something deep and guttural. The crucifix in Father Michael's hand grew hot, and he dropped it with a gasp. Ryan laughed, a low, chilling sound that didn't belong to an 8-year-old. That night, I locked Ryan's door from the outside, my hands trembling. Is it him? I asked Father Michael. He shook his head. No, whatever's inside him, it isn't your son. Then what is it? Father Michael's face was grave. I don't know yet, but I do know this. It's powerful, and it's not going to leave willingly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, listening to the faint whispers coming from Ryan's room. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the unthinkable. My son wasn't my son anymore. The house felt colder after that night, as if Ryan, or whatever was inside him, was sucking the warmth and light from the air. Father Michael returned the following day, armed with more than just prayers. He brought tools, candles, incense, a thick leather-bound book filled with ancient text. This is beyond a blessing, he told me, his voice low. We need to perform a minor exorcism. I nodded, my heart pounding. Will it hurt him? Father Michael hesitated. I'll do everything in my power to protect Ryan. But you need to understand, this won't be easy. Ryan sat in the living room, his small frame hunched over the coffee table as he drew furiously. Ryan, I said softly. He didn't look up. Father Michael stepped forward. Hello, Ryan, he said gently. Ryan's pencil froze mid-stroke. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto the priest. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice flat. Father Michael remained calm. I'm here to help you. Ryan's lips curled into a sneer. You can't help me. We moved forward with the exorcism despite Ryan's protests. Father Michael instructed me to restrain Ryan, though the thought of holding down my own son made me feel sick. I don't want to hurt you, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Ryan's eyes met mine, and for a moment they softened. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. My grip loosened. Ryan, are you? Before I could finish, his face twisted into a malicious grin. You're so easy to fool, he hissed, his voice layered with something deep and guttural. Father Michael began reciting the prayers, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Ryan thrashed against my hold, his small body radiating an unnatural strength. His voice rose in a guttural growl, spitting venomous words in a language I didn't understand. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping sharply. The candles flickered, their flames stretching toward the boy as if drawn by an invisible force. Leave this child, Father Michael commanded, holding the crucifix high. Ryan's laughter filled the room, a low, menacing sound that seemed to echo from the walls. The more Father Michael pressed, the more violent Ryan became. His eyes rolled back into his head, his body convulsing. He shouted words that didn't make sense, his voice alternating between high-pitched screams and guttural growls. I am not leaving, he bellowed, his voice distorted. You have no power here, Father Michael retorted, his voice firm. In the name of God, I command you to leave this child. Ryan's body arched, his screams piercing the air. For a moment, I thought it was working, and then the room went silent. Ryan's body went limp, his breathing shallow. "Ryan," I whispered, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, I saw my son, the real Ryan, staring back at me. "Mom," he said weakly. I sobbed, pulling him into my arms. "I'm here, sweetheart. It's okay." But Father Michael's expression was grim. "It's not over," he said. As if on cue, Ryan's body stiffened. His head snapped back, his eyes darkening once more. "You'll never take him from me," the voice growled. The entity's presence grew stronger, its energy oppressive and suffocating. Father Michael adjusted his stance, his jaw set with determination. "Then I'll force you out." He reached for the vial of holy water and began to sprinkle it over Ryan, his prayers growing louder. Ryan screamed, a blood-curdling sound that made my skin crawl. "You're hurting him," I cried, my heart breaking. "This isn't him," Father Michael shouted back. "Trust me." The struggle continued for what felt like hours. Ryan's body writhed, his voice shifting between pleas for help and guttural threats. The air grew colder, the shadows on the walls twisting unnaturally. "Who are you?" Father Michael demanded. "Name yourself." The entity laughed, a deep, echoing sound. "I have many names," it said. "But you can call me Legion." Father Michael's face paled. "Legion," he whispered. "What does that mean?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "It means we're dealing with something far worse than I thought," he said grimly. The entity taunted us, its voice mocking and cruel. "You'll never save him," it hissed. "He belongs to me now." "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "He's my son. You can't have him." Ryan's head turned sharply, his dark eyes boring into mine. "You're too weak to stop me," it spat. Father Michael stepped forward, holding the crucifix close to Ryan's face. "By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this child." Ryan let out an ear-piercing scream, his body convulsing violently. The final moments of the exorcism were a blur. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the air thick and electric. Father Michael's prayers grew louder, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. Ryan's screams reached a crescendo, his body thrashing as if trying to escape its own skin. And then suddenly everything stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. Ryan's body went limp, his breathing shallow but steady. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Father Michael hesitated, his eyes scanning the room. "For now," he said. I cradled Ryan in my arms, tears streaming down my face. Is he okay?" I asked. Father Michael knelt beside me, placing a hand on Ryan's forehead. "The entity is gone," he said softly, "but the battle isn't over. We'll need to stay vigilant." I nodded, though fear still gnawed at me. Ryan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Mom," he said weakly. "I'm here, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. But as I held him close, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as I tucked Ryan into bed, I noticed a faint mark on his arm, a small, circular burn, like the imprint of a ring. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tight. Ryan glanced at the mark, his expression blank. "I don't know," he said. But as I turned off the light and closed the door, I couldn't help but feel that the mark was a warning, a sign that the darkness wasn't finished with us yet. The days after the exorcism were deceptively calm. Ryan seemed like himself again, though quieter, as if a part of him had been hollowed out by the ordeal. He slept through the night without the whispers or strange behavior. I allowed myself to hope that it was truly over. But deep down, I knew better. The mark on Ryan's arm didn't fade. It seemed to grow darker each day, the edges red and angry. When I asked him about it, he always shrugged, as if it didn't bother him. Father Michael checked in daily, his concern palpable. The entity might not be gone for good, he warned. It could be waiting for the right moment to return. I tried to prepare myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It started with the dreams. I began waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The images were always the same. A dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, its eyes glowing like embers. "Give him back," it would say, its voice low and menacing. When I blinked, the figure would vanish, leaving me gasping for air. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of the trauma. But when Ryan began waking up screaming, clutching at his arm where the mark burned brightest, I knew it wasn't just me. Father Michael returned the following day, his face grim. "This isn't over," he said, pacing the living room. "The entity left a piece of itself behind. It's using Ryan as an anchor. What do we do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Father Michael paused, his expression heavy. "There's only one option left, a full exorcism." The word hung in the air like a death knell. "Will it work?" I asked. "It has to," he said, "but it will be dangerous. For all of us." We prepared that night. Father Michael instructed me to clear the house of anything that could be used as a weapon. He set up a small altar in the living room, complete with candles, holy water, and the crucifix that had burned so fiercely during the first attempt. "This will be unlike anything you've experienced," he warned. "You'll need to stay strong. No matter what happens, don't lose faith." I nodded, though my hands trembled as I gripped the rosary he had given me. Ryan sat silently on the couch, watching us with an unnerving calm. "Are you going to hurt me again?" he asked, his voice small. "No, sweetheart," I said, kneeling in front of him. "We're going to help you." Ryan's eyes darkened, a flicker of something else passing across his face. "You can try," he said. The exorcism began at midnight. Father Michael stood before Ryan, his voice steady as he recited the prayers. The air grew thick almost immediately, a palpable tension pressing down on us. Ryan sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the priest. At first, nothing happened, but then, as Father Michael sprinkled holy water over him, Ryan let out a low, guttural growl. "You think you can banish me?" the voice snarled, echoing through the room. Father Michael didn't falter. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this child." Ryan's body jerked violently, his small frame contorting in unnatural ways. His eyes rolled back, and his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. "You're too late," the entity hissed. "He's already mine?" "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "You can't have him." Ryan turned to me, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You gave him to me the moment you doubted him," the voice said, mocking. The words cut deep, but Father Michael's voice rose above the chaos. "You have no claim here," he shouted, holding the crucifix high. The room erupted in chaos. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching impossibly high. Shadows writhed across the walls, their shapes twisting and contorting. Ryan screamed, his voice splitting into multiple tones that reverberated through the house. Father Michael continued his prayers, his voice unwavering. "By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this child and return to the darkness." Ryan's body convulsed, his screams turning into guttural roars. "You cannot win," the entity bellowed. But Father Michael pressed on, his prayers growing louder and more forceful. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Ryan's body thrashed, his voice alternating between pleas for help and vicious threats. The mark on his arm burned brightly, its edges glowing like embers. I clutched the rosary tightly, praying silently. "Please," I whispered, "don't take him from me." Finally, Ryan let out a blood-curdling scream, his body arching as if being pulled by an invisible force. A dark, shadowy figure seemed to rise from him, its form indistinct but terrifying. "No," it howled, its voice shaking the very walls. "In the name of Christ, be gone," Father Michael commanded, his voice ringing with authority. With a final, agonized shriek, the shadow dissolved into nothingness. Ryan collapsed, his body limp and lifeless. "Ryan," I cried, rushing to his side. Father Michael knelt beside me, checking for a pulse. "He's alive," he said, his voice relieved. "But we need to let him rest." I held Ryan close, tears streaming down my face. "Is it over?" I asked. Father Michael nodded, though his expression was weary. "For now," he said, "but you'll need to keep him safe. The darkness might try to return." The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and relief. Ryan seemed like himself again, his laughter and lightness returning. The mark on his arm faded slowly, leaving only a faint scar. But the memory of what had happened lingered. Late at night, I would wake up, half expecting to see the shadowy figure at the foot of my bed. And sometimes, when Ryan looked at me, I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Something I prayed was just my imagination. As Father Michael prepared to leave, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've been through a great trial," he said. "But remember, faith and love are stronger than any darkness." I nodded, though my heart remained heavy. Ryan was safe for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle wasn't truly over. That night, as I tucked Ryan into bed, he looked up at me with a small, hesitant smile. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes, sweetheart? Do you still love me?" Tears filled my eyes as I pulled him into a tight hug. "Of course I do," I said. "Always." But as I turned off the light and closed the door, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the faint glow of the hallway light, I thought I saw the shadow of something watching me. And deep in my heart, I knew the darkness wasn't finished with us yet.